Joe Ruda has been the attorney for MNYBA. Joe, I don't know how many years, but it's been at least 20, maybe more. And he's based in New York and New Jersey. Joe is, well, both Joe and Lane are graduates of the Brooklyn Law School. And Joe has been a past president of the New York City chapter of the Christian Legal Society and also served on the national board. Lane is a lawyer that specializes in nonprofit governance and legal matters, who at one time was, I think, chief legal counsel for Times Square Church, if I'm not mistaken, yes. Lane. So we want to say thank you to Joe, thank you to Lane, all of you for being here. Perhaps we'll have a chance to pray at the end, but Joe, I want to turn it over to you and to start us off and get us going.
George, thank you so much for allowing us this opportunity to be able to present to different churches and MNYBA group. And the reason that this, let me just preface this. This is a guidance only seminar, right? It's not legal advice. It's just to give you a issue. What's the best way to put this? Is to identify the potential issues that may be out there. And the reason why is that we've just been seeing way too many churches in recent years coming to us where they're in internal conflict, dispute, litigation, or potential litigation, and where those things could have been avoided had just some simple things been done from a, basically a governance, just a review process of documents and that kind of thing. So that's what motivated this, because I really, and Lane as well, I do not like when churches are involved in litigation. I don't like to be involved in it. And I just think it besmirches the name of Christ. And if we can avoid that by simply reviewing our documents and our governance, then we really should. So, and by the way, I just want to let you know that it's not solely churches. A lot of corporations have the issue of, kind of having their documents and then never looking at them again. And all of a sudden a problem comes up and they look and they realize, wow, we really should have looked at what our governance documents said. So, my background, I've been practicing law for almost 31 years now. A lot of it is in corporate, not-for-profit. I also do litigation, so I'm kind of familiar with both sides of the whole thing. And I think it's a benefit because I like to keep my clients out of litigation by making sure that you're doing what they need to do. That's basically my background. Lane is senior counsel to the firm. You've heard a little about it from George, but Lane, why don't you introduce yourself?
Perfect. Yeah, and as Joe said, it's an honor to be here. I know that you're really busy, and Monday is the day of rest for those in the pastorate. Am I right? So I've been practicing for about 17 years now, and my career has come full circle. I interned with Joe during my law school years, and then as George mentioned, was in-house counsel for Times Square Church for 13 years and did a lot of operations work and multi-site work and launched campuses and did HR and pretty much everything except sing or preach while I was at TSC. So that was great, but I spent some time at another law firm for a few years during the pandemic and then have just been able to join Joe this last fall. So my focus of my practice is on governance and good governance for churches and religious nonprofits. So, and we wanted to, as we get started, just give you a quick overview of where we're going with the, here we go, with the presentation tonight. So we're doing Church Law 101. We're going to hit a number of topics pretty hard. And we'll go quickly. Everybody can see this? Okay, great. So Joe's going to kick it off and talk about church governance. And, he already talked some about why that's so important. we'll talk about bylaws and policies, property considerations relating to exemption and other issues, insurance coverage, issues with employees, and finally, we'll close it out with child protective policies. So as George said, any questions, put them in the chat. And I think we've scheduled some time to be able to answer questions at the end, but hopefully we'll be, answering them as we go. So Joe, you want to kick it off for governance?
Excellent. Thank you. So starting off with governance, we see a lot of times that church leaders are either not following their own governance documents, not updating them to reflect their current practices or best practices. Okay. And there's the 4 C's of church governance. There's 1, being compliant with the law and best practices. There's 2, being customized to your church. And what that means is there's some churches that are urban churches, there's some suburban, some are rural, some are small, some are large. You need to customize the governance documents to the type of church you are. And once that happens, those governance documents need to be communicated appropriately. Each policy, each procedure should be communicated to the members and establish what the policy is, who needs to know, and how any changes will be communicated to your members. The third thing is that they need to be, well, the communication I already gave you. The 4th thing actually is consistently applied. And I've talked a little bit about that already. You need to follow the standards that you've set for your church. Documents need to have good faith reasons why, or if you deviate from your documents, you need to have a good faith reason why you're doing so, and you need to communicate that. So going off of the 4 C's, the next thing is, and we find this happening a lot in churches, not having the sufficient amount of board meetings. The bylaws say you should have a board meeting once every quarter or once a month, and it's just not happening pursuant to what the bylaws are saying. So the minimum we recommend is at least 4 times a year. Trustee elections are critical. This is you may think I'm beating a drum, but we've run into churches that have had the same trustees for years and years and years, and their bylaws will say that a trustee election should happen every year, but it's been 5 years and trustee elections have not happened. The requirement for trustees is between 3 and 18, okay, for the Baptist churches. So that's important to follow that. And representation. So this is an important thing. You want to make sure that your trustees are defined in the classes that the bylaws speak of, and consider whether there is proper representation in your congregation amongst the trustees. So what am I saying by that? I'm saying if you have a really young congregation, then you might want to make sure that you have at least a trustee that's under 40 years of age that's representing the younger side of your congregation. There's also other, best practices and bylaws, and Lane will get into this, tiering your trustees and, making sure that, you're having those proper elections in the tiers. Membership. This is a big litigation issue. Is your membership list current? We just had a recent situation where a church wanted to let go of their pastor because of inappropriate conduct, and they realized that they did not have an up-to-date membership list, and they had to go and try and recreate the membership list, and that was an effort, and it also creates possible disputes within the dispute, because now not only are we having an issue with whether we should terminate the pastor, but who are the members that are allowed to vote on the termination of the pastor? They didn't even know what vote was required to terminate the pastor, because they just terminated the pastor as the trustees, but then realized that their bylaws required that the members vote 2/3 in order to terminate their pastor. we'll talk more about employment agreement later, but that was a big issue and it was a big problem. So you just want to make sure that you are keeping that membership list. And the other thing is also documenting anything that's going on with your members, right? Are you having a disciplinary issue with a member? Are you documenting that? Are you following your bylaws when you need to with regard to the removal of a member? And by the way, do your bylaws say what you want them to say with regard to the removal of a member? You know, has it not been looked at in 40 years? So that's critical. Documentation. And you may think, well, this is kind of simple stuff, but you'd be shocked at how many calls we get where each one of these things is not being followed, or multiple aspects are not being followed. So documentation. Are you having proper corporate records? When there is a board meeting or trustee meeting, are you actually having minutes for those meetings? And are you having proper documentation regarding the election of trustees and the other important aspects that happen on an annual basis? Do you have a record retention policy? Right? Most churches don't. A lot of corporations don't, but they're pretty complicated and they go into great depth on what documents you need to keep over certain periods of time. And it's complicated. I couldn't even tell you off the top of my head because we research it and we have a really comprehensive document retention policy so that you make sure that the documents that you need to keep, you're keeping for the proper amount of time. And by the way, I mean, some of these documents, I'll give you for instance, because I'm defending in New York State some, you know, you had the statute of limitations that allowed for, you know, these abuse cases to be brought many years later. And you would be surprised at the search that needs to go on with regard to insurance policies. And they can't find their insurance policy. And you know, then trying to communicate with every insurance carrier that they're, so I mean, I can tell you one thing, I would keep your insurance policies for as long as you possibly can keep your insurance policy documents, because you never know what's going to happen. And you want to be able to go back and say, this is who was our insurance carrier back in the day. Lane, I'm going to turn it over to you for bylaws and policies.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think Joe hit it right on the head, and our governance and bylaws sections are really intertwined. So I'm going to talk a little bit about bylaws and policies, but Joe's exactly right. Insurance coverage, that's a lifetime document. You know, your bylaws, those are documents you should be keeping for the life of your church. Cloud, you know, storing things in the cloud has made it so much easier. I've been working with a brand new organization just today, and they just adopted their bylaws and all of their policies, and it's all on Google Docs, and 4 people have access to it. And hopefully that's, you know, they're getting set up well in the beginning, but it's, you know, I think not-for-profits and churches are so complex, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't believe generally pastors don't have business degrees or have the privilege of taking a church in the law course. So there's so much that's involved in a not-for-profit that's way more complicated than even, you know, corporate governance. So I'm going to go into some best practices for bylaws and a few of the necessary policies that we have to see. So you can see where I'm going. So we'll talk about bylaws and how often they should be updated, some of the commonly missing elements of bylaws that I see. We'll talk a little bit about your statement of faith and make sure that your church has a properly adopted statement of faith in line with your denomination's beliefs. Whistleblower policies, conflict of interest policies, investment policies, and we'll touch a little bit on record retention policy, but I think we're already good on that one. So as Joe said, one of the major issues that we see with churches is that you write bylaws when you found the church or somebody else founded the church, and then they're never looked at again. And so those bylaws, which should be the guide, it should be the how-to for how you're operating the organization, they wind up really out of date, and they wind up not fitting the needs of the church. And you can create this gap for yourself where you've got confusion. And so what I always encourage pastors when I'm talking to them about, this part of the job is that proper procedure is going to prevent confusion and conflict. So that's where I get such a passion about this. And having these bylaws ready, it keeps you ready for positive opportunities. There's a lot of churches that I've seen in the last several years where you've got older congregations who own property, but they're dying, their congregation is dying out or moving away. And, I've dealt with a couple of churches where they've wanted to give that building to a new upcoming church, where we've seen so many church plants come into the city in the last 10 or 15 years, but they don't have property. So those blends are really necessary, but that kind of merger or property transfer requires attorney general or court approval. And if your bylaws aren't in line, if they're not compliant with the law, it's going to make that merger process a little more complicated. So one of the positive reasons why you've got to have updated bylaws. One of the major things that I see with bylaws where churches get confused is that you'll have multiple boards defined in some bylaws. And by that, I mean, you might have a board of trustees, but you may also have an elder board or a deacon board or a pastoral board or all four of those. And typically, and there's nothing wrong with that kind of governance structure because they may have different roles. But what we see with churches when they're adopting multiple boards is that they're not clearly identifying what board is responsible for which decisions and who may have the power to overrule. For example, you may only want the trustees to be able to approve the church budget, but you may only want the deacon board to be approving, benevolence, giving to the congregation members, something like that. Every board member should be properly, fully familiar with the bylaws and all of the policies of the organization. And then every board member should be properly onboarded to the board. That's one of the things that I love to help churches accomplish, is get board members answer their questions as they're coming on. Because it's one of the reasons why people may not be stepping up to volunteer as a director or a trustee, is just that confusion of what is going to be required of me, and is this going to take over my life? So then consistency, of course, going back to one of our 4 C's, consistency is so key. A lot of pastors, this is one other thing that I see with a lot of churches, is that whenever, when you take on reviewing your bylaws as a project, which of course you should be doing every 3 to 5 years, make sure they're up to date. When you're reviewing those bylaws, that's where your attention lies. And so the temptation is to make it the best possible bylaws that you have, but then later on, your consistency may slip a little bit. And if you are a small church, and we talked in those 4 C's about customizing policies and procedures for your church, there's a temptation to take some of the big church offerings that are out there. Andy Stanley's organization makes all of their bylaws available. There's other orgs that have everything available, but what's right for suburban churches does not work in an urban environment. I've seen that over and over again. So you've got organizations like Start Church that are helping churches get going, but their bylaws they're just not designed for a New York religious corporation, especially one that might be operating out of a public school in the Bronx on Sundays. It just doesn't work. So what I see is boards will adopt these bylaws that have a really high standard for their own operations when the practice is really down here, and they've created this gap. And so the consistency just isn't there. And that lack of consistency can wind up creating liability. Second item is your statement of faith. I would assume everyone has a properly adopted statement of faith. And that since we're dealing with Baptist denomination, that you're also adopting a statement of faith that has a really clear description of your views on sexual orientation and gender identity. That's obviously become a really hot button topic. And we've switched over even from, 10 years ago, all we were talking about was sexual orientation and really getting into our statement of faith that, we believe marriage is between a man and a woman. Well, that statement right now, that's not answering the questions that our communities are asking at this point. So you want to see your board and your congregation properly adopting a statement of faith in line with what your denomination has, making sure that you've got those descriptions out there. Your required policies for New York, whistleblower policies, conflict of interest, investment, and then record retention is a best practice. Whistleblower policies operate to help people. We're familiar with those from, stock option tradings. We all know what whistleblower policies are, right? Maybe thumbs up, thumbs down. Okay, we've got some. So a whistleblower policy operates to protect people from retaliation when their boss or someone in their organization isn't operating, but the regular complaint line isn't going anywhere. If I have an issue, let's say I work in accounts receivable and I think that the church treasurer isn't doing things correctly, but she's my superior, he's my superior, and that's who I complain to, and it's not getting answered. The whistleblower policy protects me as a whistleblower. I can't get fired for a good faith complaint, but I can take that straight to usually a board member is the whistleblower. And New York actually just changed the law. The labor law updated in February of 2023, and it's now every organization in New York that has more than one employee is required to have a whistleblower policy with some pretty significant protections. And it includes employees and independent contractors, which Joe will talk about later. And it also has new requirements for where that policy has to be posted conspicuously in an easily accessible and well-lighted place customarily frequented by employees. So these are the nitty-gritty things of church governance that you didn't get taught in seminary. So you want to, with your whistleblower policy, you want to broadly define what actions may qualify. A lot of organizations adopted this in response to the Not-for-Profit Revitalization Act back in 2013. But you want to look at, especially in light of what we've seen with Me Too and Church Too, you want to look at, are you addressing any kind of sexual harassment claims that may have come up in your church, making sure that that's, covered by your policy. And that policy also, one of the main issues that I see with churches and organizations is that they don't communicate that policy wide enough. The new expansion with the labor law should help take care of this, but you want to make sure that this policy is known beyond the board members to your employees as per the new labor law. But I also want churches to really consider if some of their key volunteers should also be aware of this, the whistleblower policy. And then you've got your conflict of interest policy. And that just helps you to make sure that your board members are not voting on questions where they may have a financial interest. So it's also known as related party transactions in the not-for-profit law. And it requires, the law sets out guidelines for situations in which a board member or a volunteer providing special services may need to recuse themselves from a decision. And I see this a lot with churches where you might have, people on the board who own a building and the church needs to rent some space. It doesn't mean you can't rent space from that board member. It just means that board member can't vote on the transaction. and that transaction has to be fair and reasonable. So you want to look at, in that scenario, you would want to look at 3 different bids for different places and make sure that you're documenting why this is the right choice for your organization and a good use of its resources. So conflict of interest policies, that's that one. And then investment policies also are the guidelines for how your church is going to invest any of the money that it has outside of its cash operating budget. However, even if you're operating solely on that cash operating budget and there's no additional endowment or, significant savings, it's a required document to have. And so it just helps to set up kind of a pre-decision for how you're going to make, gives you ranges for where you're going to invest money based on where you are as a church. Every church has a different financial situation. But the crux of the Prudent Management of Institutional Funds Act is that you really want to see contemporaneous documentation of the reasons why. So you want to see real time, you can't draft those board meeting minutes like we were talking about earlier. You can't draft those board meeting minutes a year after the fact. They've got to be done within a week or so. So you've got that contemporaneous documentation of why the board thought this was a prudent idea. If you're relying on advice from a financial advisor, that's great. We want to outsource some of our decisions to people who have the expertise, but the board should be documenting why they chose that financial advisor. And the reason can't be, it's the guy who goes to our church. We've got to look at the total package, and the board needs to document all of those items. So that's bylaws and policies. And I saw a few questions come up in the chat. So we'll have time, I think, to get through those afterward. I'm going to turn now to talking a little bit about property considerations. So we're going to talk about exemptions to start with, and then we'll talk about the sale and transfer of property, and then we'll close it out with a little bit about facility security. So exemptions, property tax exemptions, obviously all property, real property that is held in the name of a not-for-profit corporation and being used for that purpose should be exempt from property tax. In New York, you need to renew that exemption annually. Within the 5 boroughs, that renewal date is, hypothetically, it's January 5th. It's really it's April, sometime in April. But you need to be submitting that renewal by January 5th every year and make sure that you're current on those exemptions. Other municipalities outside of the city in Jersey, that's going to be a little bit different. And then one thing that we've seen crop up a little bit more with larger organizations that own multiple properties, there was an IRS ruling back in 2012 that established that single member LLCs are eligible for the tax exemption of their parent. So if you're a church that owns multiple locations, you may want to hypothetically limit some liability by buying additional property with a single member LLC. That would still be covered under your property tax exemption. You want to make sure any church-owned parsonages are also under that exemption. That can be a little more difficult to fight with some of the municipalities for getting the exemption on. It's a different section of the law, those exemptions for parsonages, so they can be a little trickier. But in order to be eligible for the exemption, that does have to be held in the name of the church. The sale or transfer of any real property owned by a church or not-for-profit, sale, transfer, or lease for more than 5 years is subject to it's got to be approved by the Attorney General before that sale goes through. And that's a process that we work with a lot. And then for you as Article 7 corporations, you also are required to have a 2/3 vote of your congregation in order to approve the sale of any property that you own. And finally, facility security. Obviously there's been, a rise of incidents of violence in churches, and I'm sure we've all already heard about the horrific events in Nashville today at Covenant Presbyterian School. It's a very real issue. That is, it hits close to home for me. My husband's aunt was in Sutherland Springs in Texas in that shooting a couple of years ago, and she lived through it. But obviously has, still the scars, physical and emotional. Churches are a soft target. It's a place where, everybody's welcome. You can come in, the door's unlocked, and, obviously things happen. So I really encourage churches to establish and adopt some kind of security ministry, security team, something like that, and make sure that they're planning for security, not only in their service hours, but also during their office hours and during any special events. When you're inviting the community in, it's a wonderful thing, but it also poses additional risks. So facility security is definitely another area that a lot of churches are paying more attention to now than they did 10 years ago. And I think New York has been ahead of the curve for that, compared to churches across the country. And finally, just simple liability issues. You're inviting people into your church, your facility. Slip and fall, it remains one of the top 5 reasons that churches wind up in court every year. So making sure that you're doing that maintenance on the church, that you have your volunteers are aware of who to report to if they see something that needs repair, because you've got to, you have that obligation to keep your place of business free of, places where people can slip and fall. So that's it for property. Joe, I'm going to turn it back to you for insurance.
Thanks, Elaine. So, just even going back to property tax exemption, we just got done dealing with a church that had failed to file for property tax exemption for 25 years. 25 years. And it was New York City, and it wasn't, hundreds of thousands, but over the course of time, it was more than $100,000. And it's difficult to try and go back in time. So important to make sure that you're filing the proper documents to maintain your tax exemption. Insurance, we spoke about it a little bit. Insurance is so critical. Making sure that you've looked at your policy every 3 to 5 years. Make sure that you have the right insurance coverage limits. You can speak to an attorney, you can speak to your broker, but speak to someone to make sure that you have the coverages that you need with regard to your church. Church litigation has increased exponentially. Where 20 or 30 years ago, people would be hesitant to sue a church. That's no more. That's out the window. And the exclusions, I spoke to you a little bit about the sexual abuse cases. There's churches that have policies, but they don't have a policy with regard. The policy doesn't cover sexual abuse. Mm-hmm. So there were some churches that I was representing that found that there was a policy, but the policy didn't cover them. And these are matters that happened many, many years ago. But so it's understandable back then. It wasn't really, it was not the issue it is today. And notice of claim. Now, New York is somewhat flexible with this because the insurance company needs to show that it was prejudiced. But if you've got a potential litigation issue, notify the insurance carrier. Speak to your attorney first, right? But it's so important to just put them on notice. Even if nothing happens, at least they can't say to you, you didn't tell us. This was 3 years ago. Or if it's a child, right, and they're 10 years old, they can sue you up to 3 years after they turn 18. So, the insurance companies now, listen, this is 10 years ago. You didn't give us any notice. We're getting sued 10 years later, and we're prejudiced because none of the witnesses, no one's around, and now they're making this claim against you, and we don't have anything that we need. So super important to provide that notice to the insurance carrier. Turning to employees. This is a critical mistake. Not just churches, but literally every corporation. I've seen it over and over and over again, where you'll have an organization that will pay a person as though they're an independent contractor, but in reality, they're an employee. Anytime you're dictating the means and methods of the work and what they're going to do, they're an employee. I mean, there's a lot of, the Department of Labor has a lot of different criteria, but I advise my companies, both profit and not for profit. If you're going to have someone you're going to claim as an independent contractor, then they better have their own business. I don't like them just having an individual. They better have their own business. They better have their own EIN, their own insurance, and they're not in your premises day in and day out with a desk and they only work for you, right? That's a problem, because what ends up happening is if you terminate that person, then they're going to go and file for unemployment, and what happens, right? There's going to be an issue because they weren't an employee. You weren't paying the proper taxes for an employee. So problem. And then if you're going to have an independent contractor, make sure you have agreements with them. There should be proper independent contractor agreements where there's indemnification. If something happens and there's a suit and they sue the independent contractor and they're suing the church, that the independent contractor's insurance will cover the church for that lawsuit, as opposed to the church having to deal with it and pick it up. Employment agreements. I'm a firm believer that you should have employment agreements, especially with your senior people, critical, right? And what are, I'm a big, proponent of employee at will and making sure that's in your contract. But listen, most pastors are going to want a term of employment and a termination with regard to cause, right? What's the cause for you terminating me? I don't want to come in here and move my family from North Carolina to New York, and then 3 months later you're like, goodbye, and you're like, well, wait a second, I just uprooted everything. So those senior positions are going to want to have some kind of assurance, and that needs to be negotiated, and you need to have smart provisions in there that protect both sides, right? Protect the pastor, protect the church. Critical. And those employment agreements really should have clear descriptions. The next thing, the ministerial exception, this is critical, right? If you're a church or not-for-profit, you want to define your employment agreements where people are involved in ministry. Because if they're not, okay, then you have a big problem if you want to terminate someone because of conduct that you believe is not becoming to the ministry, and they say, well, so what? You can't discriminate against me on the basis of religion. I don't do anything religious. This is my role. My job description doesn't have anything like that in there, and you're gonna find yourself in a problem. You're gonna find yourself in an issue with the city of New York, which laws are very, very strict when it comes to that kind of thing. Very strict. Paid family leave. There's a lot of different criteria depending on the amount of employees that you have, whether it's federal, state, city. Important to know the standards and whether you're going to be subject to it or not. Clergy are exempt from the requirement, but you can opt in. Sexual harassment training. Annual training is required for employees. So if you're not doing that, you're not following the law. They need to attend. You can go online. It's a video that they have to watch and say that they watch it, and you'll meet that criteria. And by the way, you can customize that training to reflect your beliefs on sexuality and gender roles. Okay, especially as being a church. So you have that there. This is getting into the weeds, but it's an important area because a lot of it is really ignored. And hey, listen, you may go 20 or 30 years, it may never come up. It may be 50 years. The problem is it's coming up more and more in our current society and what's going on, especially in New York. Elaine, child protective policies?
Absolutely. All right, let's go. Yeah, I agree with everything Joe just said. On the employment side, we see a lot of issues with that. But child protective policies and sexual abuse of a minor, it remains the number one reason why churches wind up in court. And I think we're all, you can't avoid the conversation about sexual abuse in the church and the impact that it's had on the churches as corporations and the church as a global body of believers. So we're going to talk a little bit about the necessary components of a good child protective policy, the screening, training, environmental concerns, and finally reporting and investigation. But I just want you to take a look. If you don't currently have a subscription to Church Law and Tax, a lot of you probably do, or you might have Pastor Church and Law, Richard Hammer's huge, gigantic, I think it's a 2-volume book now. But it really is such a useful handbook for things like this. But he has done, he's an attorney and a CPA, and he has done an annual, just overview of every litigation in the United States that involved a church. And the top 5 are sexual abuse of a minor, property disputes, personal injury, zoning issues, and insurance coverage disputes. So all of those things that we have been talking about. But we'll go back and let's talk about screening, training, environmental considerations, and reporting and investigation. And I'll just say child protective policies and in churches, that's why I got hired at Times Square. I had worked in Kings County Family Court, clerking with a judge there and working with a law guardian for children who were being removed from homes. So I've got a background in child protective policies. And it's just not something that we can ignore at this point in time. And there are so many resources out there outside, we'd love to have conversations with you after this about crafting child protective policies for your churches. But there's also so many additional resources out there. There's a new organization called Evangelical Council for Abuse Prevention. You're probably familiar with ECFA. ECAP is a new organization that's about 2 years old they're looking to do accreditation of churches that are properly meeting child protective policy considerations. I actually wrote an article for them a couple of months ago about child protective policies for smaller churches, because so much of the guidance out there is for the big mega churches in suburbia. So I'm happy to share that. If you want to shoot me an email, we'll have our email addresses up at the end. But so child protective policies, ECAP, Brotherhood Mutual has a ton of really good resources on their website. Protect My Ministry has some good resources. There's stuff out there before you come and talk to us. There's a lot available. But so these are the big 4: the screening, training, environment, and then reporting, and kind of a what do you do if is the question. So with screening, the non-negotiables for me are that churches have a minimum attendance requirement before they allow volunteers to have access to children. And I'm breaking my own rules. I've been really intentional about not just saying children, because it's actually your teens. It's 12 to 16, 17, 18. They are the most vulnerable population in your church. That's where it's happening. So teens, youth, and don't forget, if you have a ministry to special needs adults, the same principles should apply. Or even as you're making those senior ministries, if you have seniors involved in your seniors ministry who are having some diminished capacity issues, you really need to look at adopting similar policies to these for volunteers that work with all vulnerable populations in your church. So 6 months attendance before volunteering. Typically, I like to see that they've volunteered somewhere else in the church too. If you have a robust enough volunteer base, I would recommend that. If you just don't, 6 months at a minimum. A criminal background check is a non-negotiable for every single person who comes in contact with vulnerable populations. I typically advise that you do criminal background checks for anybody with access to kids, money, or space. So if they have the keys to the entire building, I want you to have a criminal background check on them. Not necessarily for sexual abuse connotations, but you understand why, right? So with the criminal background check, especially as it regards to child protective policies, we also have to keep in mind that less than 10% of abusers will ever encounter the criminal justice system. So we don't stop in our screening with 6 months and a criminal background check. We also do a reference check. We get to know that person. I want to talk to at least 3 people that they either worked with. Ideally, I want to talk to another pastor that they volunteered under. So you've got to get a release form from them saying it's okay, there's no defamation claims or anything. We're going to go and talk to people that you've given us, but you've got to use your discernment. Those reference conversations are not something, it's a great way I've found for a lot of young moms don't necessarily want to volunteer in the nursery, right? They're with their kids all week. Sunday, they need a break. They want to go they want to go worship. But those young moms may be willing to make these reference checks and make those calls and make sure that the people who are taking care of their kids are properly screened and trained. So then training is the second prong of a good child protective policy. You've got to educate the volunteers on the signs of grooming in churches and beyond, how to recognize signs of abuse. Having that information, and a lot of churches, I've loved seeing this, a lot of churches have expanded those classes to the parents, particularly with the parents of teens. I have a 13 and a 16-year-old, and one of our big conversations at home is how are we navigating social media and what are we engaging in online? What access do we as their parents have to their devices? Spoiler alert, it's all the access. But you want to make sure, it's a great opportunity and helps your parents in the congregation feel a lot more comfortable that their kids are in a safe place with you. So that's training, and that training should be done when people come on as volunteers or staff in that area. And then there should be refreshers every year or two, kind of whenever you get that influx and you go, okay, it's time to look at it. Then environmental considerations, the baseline for me is that if you have 2 unrelated adults in a room, in every children's ministry room or teen youth room, that's going to cover a multitude of issues that you may have. You've got that second voice and that second witness. You also want to look at the visibility. And if you own your location, you have a lot more flexibility with this. If you can put a window in a door, that would be great. If you can install Dutch doors where the top opens and the bottom stays shut, that's perfect. If you're one of those suburban megachurches and you've got the 2-way glass for the infant and toddler rooms, those are my favorite. But you want to make sure that anyone in the room, that there's another set of eyes on it. Security cameras don't necessarily fill that role. I see a lot of churches ask those questions and kind of go, oh, but if they are, then they have to be monitored the whole time. So you want to make sure that visibility is there. But in light of extending these policies to your youth group as well, think and establish a policy for how your youth workers will communicate with the teens that they're ministering to. Because if we are adopting 2 adults in every room, how does that translate over texting? So I typically will advise, if your youth workers are going to text with their kids, the parents should be aware that the youth workers are texting, and it should be a group chat. It shouldn't be anything solo. Try to avoid those one-on-ones wherever you can. And finally, for reporting and investigation, when you are aware of abuse, one of the unique things about churches is that we will serve a population. We have a high percentage of homeschooling families in a lot of our congregations. And so we'll serve a lot of population that we may be the only people that they see outside of the home. And I've dealt with churches where that's been the case, and the church has been the location where abuse in the home has been discovered. So churches right now, clergy are not mandated reporters in the state of New York. Mandated reporters are doctors, teachers, people like that, for whom they are legally obligated to report abuse. In New Jersey, everyone is a mandated reporter. In New York, clergy are currently excluded, but there's legislation pending that would add them to that law for that reason. Clergy are often the only people who see vulnerable children. So my suggestion to churches is that even though we're not mandated reporters necessarily, that we function as such. Report it to ACS or DYFS, be aware of what that means for that family, but report really founded when you know. I've had to make reports probably six or seven times in the last 15 years. And it's never an easy call to make, but there's never been a doubt in my mind that the call had to be made. And then if any one of your employees or volunteers is accused of abuse, you need to immediately remove them from any access to children, teens, vulnerable adults. They are on sabbatical immediately until an investigation is concluded. That's probably, I think, one of the biggest things that historically we've seen churches not handle well is but they wouldn't do that thought. And you've got to protect the people in your congregation. So that's it for child protective policies. And it looks like we did well on time. So I think we had some questions.
Yes, Lane and Joe, I put a few on here. There may be more as we talk, but the first question I put down is that can churches have board members who are not members of the church? And one of the reasons why I raise this question is with new church starts and church plans. A lot of times they will ask people I've been asked to be a board member of a church until they get to the point where they have a membership list and people to choose from. Is that allowed? Is that right? That's the basis for the first question I put down there.
Yeah, Joe, are you okay if I take this? Awesome. I think that's okay. There's nothing in Article 7 that states that I'm aware of. There's nothing in Article 7, which is what Baptist churches are incorporated under. Nothing in there that says that you have to be a member of the church. Long term, I think that's best, especially because as a member of a denomination, you have built-in accountability to the local denominational body. So, I think that's fine. I'd look to move away from it and have, people from the congregation over time, but especially in that startup phase, totally fine.
And George, just to clarify though, Lane's 100% right. Unless your bylaws say that board members need to be members.
Yeah.
Okay.
And if your bylaws say that board members need to be members of the church, then, and a lot of them do, and they'll say you need to be a member for 6 months or a year or two, whatever it is. They'll have criteria for board members. And a lot of times that's one of the criteria.
Okay.
And it goes back to me saying, you got to know what's in your bylaws.
Right. Which brings up my second question I put on there. Not that you have a word for word template for every church to follow, but do you have some of the major headings that bylaws need to address? I know Constitution is different than bylaws, so the bylaws is how we govern, how we operate. Is there a list of sections that should be included in bylaws? Does anybody know? Is there somewhere we can find that out for each church?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's clearly sections that need to be in bylaws, right? But you need to really, I'm a firm believer that bylaws are not something that, and call me biased because I'm a lawyer, but I'm a firm believer. Listen, you want to come to our firm or any firm, please, if you're gonna amend your bylaws or draft bylaws, seek legal counsel, because you just want to make sure that those bylaws are what you want them to be and that they are consistent with the rest of your documents, right? Because it's a foundational document. You want to make sure that those bylaws are consistent with your certificate of incorporation, right? You want consistency throughout. So yeah, I mean, your bylaws are going to say, who are your officers, who are your directors, what's your policies with regard to voting in these people, right? There's going to be policies on amending your bylaws. There's a lot of different sections to bylaws. I mean, if I pulled up a bylaws, one of our bylaws that we like to use, I mean, I could go through them, but it's not something that I would just leave. By the way, I'm fine with a congregation and a board going through their bylaws and making the changes that they think are necessary, and then saying to their lawyer, hey, please take a look at this.
Yeah.
Are you okay with it? Are we following the law, and are we following the procedures to change the bylaws? And what do you think of it? Like I've had not-for-profits come to me, because they have someone that's on their board that's savvy with bylaws or has some kind of legal understanding. And by the way, I love that. Because now you're coming to me, right? And you've done some of that work that needs to take place because you've thought about the issues. And now you come to me and I can say, I'm good with this. Or did you think about that? Or, and just give them some feedback. So.
Yeah. I agree with Joe. The only thing that I'll add is that New York is really, really specific. And in a lot of other states, bylaws are pretty simple and it's the rules that you can put together. But New York, Article 7 is different from the other articles of the Religious Corporations Law. So you want to make sure that you are, like we said in those first 4 C's, that you are compliant first. But I'm with Joe. You can do a lot of the research ahead of time, because a lot of it is, how are your trustees elected? What are their roles? When are they meeting? When, who's a member? When is the members meeting? A lot of those procedures, but then you've got to have related party transactions and a whole host of other things in there that, if you do the research and then you have a conversation with some counsel, you can get it done, and it's well worth the investment.
2 more questions, I think here. One, I put down, when churches rent space, a lot of our congregations rent. They do not own their own property. So what do you recommend about insurance in that situation? How much? What should it cover? What's the relationship with the landlord and that kind of arrangement?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of that, George, is going to be dependent on what the lease says, first of all, right? Because typically, if you're renting property, the lease will get into very specific requirements. I know when I draft leases for my corporate clients, or even my not-for-profit clients, we are very specific on what insurance we want that renter, whether they're for-profit or not-for-profit, to have. So that's the first thing you want to look at. And then I would speak with whether it's lawyer or broker on what they think the amounts you should have based upon what contents you have, right? Obviously, you need to have liability insurance, right? And I'm a firm believer, depending on what you're asked, listen, everything is commensurate, right? If you're a new church and you got a piano and some hymnal books, right? And you know, you're a startup church with very little money, I'm not going to tell you to go get, you know, $5 million in liability insurance. But if you're a New York City church, right, and you're a church that has a lot of assets, I'm going to tell you, you better have at least 2 or 3 million in, you know, general liability insurance with a $5 or $10 million umbrella to cover all sorts of stuff that's going on, right? And your contents and that kind of thing. So it really depends on where you're at, you know, city, not city, small little church, wealthy church, on what kind of insurance you should have.
There was a question about how often should articles of incorporation be updated. I don't know if you can update articles of incorporation. You said update bylaws every 5 years at least, right, Lane? Yeah.
Yeah, and articles of incorporation, you can if you're changing the corporate purposes or changing the name. But generally those are, you know, that's what started your organization.
Okay.
So that'll stick with you.
Lane, could you
Lane's
read
correct.
that last entry there? It's a question specifically asked to you about teachers.
Okay, yeah, teachers in New York, I mean, teachers in schools are mandated reporters. But then teachers, doctors, social workers, New York has a really long list of those who are mandated reporters. So the question is, do those who are members of the church have a duty to report even when it's outside their professional context, like on an average Sunday? So if you have, you know, a 3rd grade teacher who is a mandated reporter in her capacity as a teacher Monday through Friday, but she's volunteering in children's ministry on Sunday, is she then a mandated reporter? Probably. It's a little unclear. But I have never met especially a New York City public school teacher who has encountered any kind of abuse who didn't immediately want to report it. You know, again, it will be rare. I've dealt with this a whole lot and I've had to report 6 or 7 times in 20 years. But it will happen. So I would say in your policy, you should adopt that they should function as such anyway. So, but those who are professionally obligated to be mandated reporters, they will generally want to report anyway, because it's their license at risk if something happens and they don't.
Right. Any of the last minute questions? You guys are going to put up your email addresses on the board for us, if you could do that.
Right now. Perfect. Yeah, so that's our contact information. You're welcome to reach out to either of us. And we'd love to talk with you.
And by the way, George said it's been probably 20 years working together. It's been a pleasure, George.
Thank you so
You know,
much,
the
Joe.
organization's great. The churches, I've had all good experiences with the MNYBA churches. So
Thank you.